Back in the long, long ago of 1995, when Magic and I were both still young, one of my favorite cards, if not my favorite card, was the Touch of Death. Absolutely awesome name, killer artwork, at least by edgy preteen standards, and, unbeknownst to me at the time, an absolute turd of a text box. It's bad, folks. So over a decade later, Wizards decided to redeem themselves for their terrible use of an awesome phrase by keywording Deathtouch onto Thornweld Archer and Future Sight. By the way, this is the first time we got to see the reach ability. History lesson today. Deathtouch just effectively codified the Basilisk ability that had struck fear in the hearts of so many players since the early days of the game, only now it was on an expanded suite of creatures. And ever since then, players have been captivated by an ability that allows creatures to play both offense and defense in interesting, expanded ways, and enables even the tiniest of 1/1s to make your opponent think twice about attacking with their 8/8. A good Deathtouch deck has long been the dream of many a casual player, and in Core Set 2021, we may have gotten the piece the Deathtouch deck has been looking for years. So today, let's talk about it. You got the touch, you got the power. Oh, hey, what's up, Wizards? It's Dev and Ziggy from SBMTG, Magic Boys. And today, we're going to finally talk about Hooded Blightfang. We're going to do it. For some reason, the patrons were super freaking excited to talk about Hooded Blightfang, but that's cool because so am I. HBF is the HBK of Standard right now, breaking hearts and snaking farts. I couldn't come up with anything there. Just a lot of scatological humor in this episode. Already, I said turd earlier, and now I've said it again. But when you're talking about 3-mana black cards, this one is much less of a turd than the one from the intro. Actually, it's the opposite of a turd. What is the opposite of a turd? A pineapple? Flowers? I don't know. Interesting philosophical question, but here's another one. What does this card do for the Deathtouch deck that the Deathtouch deck needed? Now, first of all, it kind of functions like an Anthem effect that allows your creatures to deal extra damage when they swing in. And you don't even have to wait until the damage step of combat. They immediately do guaranteed damage whether they're blocked or not, which is something the Deathtouch deck really needed. I've played Deathtouch in just about every format in the last 5 years that I've been on YouTube, and the deck has always lacked closing power, some punch to actually finish the game off. And this allows the deck to do that pretty well, especially if you get multiples. It also has a really high toughness, which is great for any Deathtouch creature, but it helps out the deck in a couple of ways. Anyone who's played Deathtouch aggro in the last couple of years can tell you that there's often a moment in some games, especially games against other aggro decks, where your focus shifts from aggro to defense. The card plays defense really well, doesn't actually have to swing to give your other creatures the bonus or anything, so it can just hang out on the battlefield, let your creatures swing in a little bit more effectively, but play defense really well itself. And finally, one of the most important things that it does in those same aggro matchups is it allows us to win races a little bit easier. Not just because of the Anthem effect, but because of the life gain that we get from swinging in with our creatures. When we do swing in, it's nice to know that we're going to give our creatures a form of effective lifelink that allows us to keep our life total up so we don't get punished too much on the crackback for swinging in the first place. All this adds up to a card that does pretty much everything the Deathtouch deck needed a card to do in order to be taken seriously. It helps you win those aggro races by gaining you a little bit of life, and against control decks and slower decks like that, it at least speeds up the clock, which is something you desperately needed in those matchups. But woo, I did it, y'all. I got through the explanation of this card without making a single joke about purple snakes. I pulled it off. But anyway, Hooded Blightfang is joined by an old friend of the Deathtouch deck from War of the Spark, old Vraska 4-drop, the bad 4-drop Vraska. But in this deck, she's the good 4-drop Vraska. This is great on curve with Hooded Blightfang because it doesn't even keep you from casting a creature on that turn. You still get a 1/1 off of Vraska, and that increases both damage and life gain output off of Hooded Blightfang, which is good right there. But this is basically yet another Anthem effect for the deck that can make your Hooded Blightfang have like 5 toughness, which is really important in more matches than you might think. And even if you don't get the snake on 3, Vraska's a great turn 4 play because it incentivizes your opponent to block your Deathtouch creatures when they might not normally do so. A lot of Deathtouch creatures are really small, so your opponent can let through, 2, 3, 4 points of damage for a turn or two and not sweat it too much. But with Vraska, if your opponent does let them through, your creatures are only going to get bigger as the game goes on, and they can't really afford to let that keep happening so long. So your opponent will often throw big creatures they otherwise wouldn't block with in front of your smaller smaller Deathtouch guys, and that's when you end up with a huge mana value. We don't talk about that enough in these Deathtouch decks when we touch on Vraska, but that's actually a very important aspect of the card. But on to the duders, because the Deathtouch deck is mostly about the creatures that have the Deathtouches. So let's talk about that, starting with the 1-drops. We got 4 copies of Foulmire Knight and 4 copies of Vampire of the Dire Moon. Now, these are the only 1-drop creatures we're playing, which may surprise you. It surprises me, honestly. My first plan for this deck, and I think a lot of people's initial plan for this deck, was to play as many 1-drop Deathtouchers as possible. That way, you play a 1-drop on turn 1, 2 1-drops on turn 2, and really increase your damage output with Hooded Blightfang when you drop it on turn 3. Great theory, but I didn't much care for it in practice. Now, at the end of the day, that's because the trouble that you go through to fill your deck with 20 1-drop Deathtouchers is not worth the extra drain or 2 that you'll get over the course of a game with a Hooded Blightfang. I would much rather just play good 2, 3, and even 4-drops in this deck than have to devote literally a third of the deck to 1-drop Deathtouchers, which I will top deck on turn 7. Instead, I'd rather just focus on playing the best 1-drop Deathtouchers in the format and not worry with stuff like the green 1-drop Deathtouchers that don't do anything else, or Hired Poison, or the black 1-drop Deathtoucher that doesn't do anything else. I'd rather play premium stuff like Foulmire Knight that at least allows us to draw cards in the late game when we top deck it. It makes it a much better top deck than just about any other Deathtouch in the format. Same thing with Vampire of the Dire Moon. At least this is a little bit of life gain in the early game, so that can help us win aggro races. I just think these are much better than the other 1-drop Deathtouch creatures we could be playing. In the 2-drop slot, I'm playing 3 copies of Cheville, Bane of Monsters, along with 4 copies of Mire Triton. There are a number of good 2-drop Deathtouch creatures you could play in this slot. I almost played Orzhov Enforcer. Enforcer is a little bit better against the Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice decks that play Mayhem Devil, because it has a higher toughness and leaves behind a creature, which is nice if you have to sacrifice it to Priests of Forgotten Gods. All in all, though, I decided Mire Triton was probably better because of the higher power stat. We're trying to close the game out as quickly as possible. That means every little point of damage counts, so I like the creature with the higher power. And this is yet another thing that allows us to win aggro races. Now, Chevy Chase has been an overperformer so far in testing this deck. He can mark creatures, and that can be really important. Mark a big creature, and your opponent won't want to swing into a team of Deathtouchers with it, because you effectively get free life and cards. Sometimes you'll have to trade a small creature for it, but you'll still often be trading that small creature for a big creature and 3 life and a card, and that is always going to be worth it. Cheville has just been a much better card than I anticipated it being. We don't have much actual removal in this deck, so often we have to swing in hoping our opponent blocks with a creature that we've marked, or we have to hope that the opponent is put into a position where they have to swing with a creature that they've marked. But either way, Cheville will often draw a card or 2 extra over the course of a game, and every card counts. Now, in the 3-drop slot, I had some decisions to make, but I ended up on Leyline Prowler here. It's yet another lifelink or life-gaining creature, so along with Hooded Blightfang and Vampire of the Dire Moon and Mire Triton and Cheville, a lot of our cards gain life, so Hooded Blightfang isn't the only thing keeping us in the game when we're racing against aggro decks. It's also important that when it's absolutely necessary, this can tap to cast a 4-drop the turn after we play it. If we don't draw our 4th land, this being able to cast a Vraska or a 4-drop creature is often extraordinarily relevant. But hey, I'm back, because you may have heard me mention a second ago that we're playing a 4-drop creature in this deck as well. You probably sussed it out. It's Questing Beast. We're gonna play Questing Beast. All 4 of them, even though it's legendary, and we're already running 4 other 4-drops. I really don't mind, because Questing Beast is far and away the best card in the deck. There is a huge margin between this card and the next card in terms of just being a good playable Magic card. Now, there's not too many other non-creature cards in the deck, but I am playing 4 copies of Ram Through here, just a godlike bite effect that we absolutely need to play. The ability to play this at instant speed is unbelievable sometimes. It can just ambush opponents. I have no idea this is coming at instant speed. I think a lot of people know that Ram Through is a card because it sees playing like Mono Green Stompy. They just have yet to internalize the card as instant speed. Just no one expects the Spanish Inquisition or this card. Ram Through has just been really cool, and even though we don't really have like any trample stuff in the deck, the instant speed is still well worth playing it over other bite effects and fight effects for that matter in the format. But that's not the only card like this that I'm playing. I mean, 4 copies of a bite effect is fairly standard for any Deathtouch deck because they're incredibly good in Deathtouch decks, but I'm also playing a 1 of Primal Might. Now, like I said, Deathtouch decks sometimes have a hard time pushing through damage fast enough, and their clock is relatively slow. Even with Blightfang and Vraska helping them out, giving them extra power effectively, the clock can still be relatively slow, especially compared to other aggro decks like Mono Red or even Mono White, which is a very good deck in this format right now, I promise you. But in any case, we need to be able to push through damage, and sometimes Primal Might can do that while also taking out a creature. Usually effects like this, we'd have to trade our creature for, if we just played Prey Upon or something like that. But this is a decent mana sink, of which we have virtually none in the deck. So on turn 4, turn 5, if you're looking to close the game out, you can even give like a 1/1. +3/+3 or +4/+4. Take out a bigger creature, survive, and then swing in, which can be really important. But in games where you've gotten a couple of counters on like a Leyline Prowler because of Vraska, suddenly you dump all your mana into this, and Leyline Prowler is like an 8-power lifelink Deathtouch thing that killed a guy. So like, Primal Might can be an amazing one-of sometimes, but I don't know that I'd want to play more than a silver bullet of this card. It's good when it needs to be, but at the same time, I feel like, Ram Through is probably a better version of this for all intents and purposes, but at the same time, even against control decks where you don't really have a target for the creature to fight against, this is just going to give a creature +4/+4, +5/+5, and punch in that last little bit of damage. So it's not a dead card against decks that don't play creatures. Now let's look at the lands. Fairly simple here. We're playing 24 of them, amongst which we have 4 Overgrown Tomb, 2 Temple of Malady, and 2 Fabled Passage. Now I've split Temple of Malady and Fabled Passage here because I don't really want to have too many tap lands in this deck. A lot of what we're doing is fairly aggro, and right now 2 mana aggro mana bases are like fairly bad. I think this deck is a good illustration of that. I'm playing Fabled Passage because it comes into play tapped less often than Temple of Malady, and can come into play untapped on turn 4 to cast a Questing Beast or a Vraska, and that can be very important. We are also playing 3 copies of Castle Locthwain, along with 8 Swamp and 5 Forest. We are heavily skewed towards black mana in this deck, but of course we do need some green sources to cast, Questing Beast for double green. So obviously we needed some green in the deck. I think we total 13 green sources plus Leyline Prowler, and Fabled Passage will help us get more green sources when we need them to. Again, that can be especially important on turn 4 to help you get the second green source for a Questing Beast. But Castle Locthwain is one of the all-stars of this deck. There are things that draw cards like Cheville and Foulmire Knight, but Castle Locthwain is just another one that makes sure we don't get stuck top decking forever, and that can be incredibly important. And it goes pretty well with all the life gain in the deck too. Now, let's take a look at the sideboard right here, starting with 2 copies of Rabid Bite and 1 copy of Primal Might. Both Bite and Might will come in during the aggro matchups. Rabid Bite is just extra copies of Ram Through effectively, and Primal Might can be really nice in those matchups too, especially if you have an open shot at the board. Primal Might can sometimes win the game, so I'm putting it in. Now, Return to Nature is also in this sideboard here, just to make sure that we can blow up important permanent types we otherwise don't have ways to do that. And then Scavenging Ooze I put in this board too, just as a 2-of. This is a way to play around in people's graveyards, keep them from doing stuff with Lurrus or escaping their Euro or taking stuff out of their graveyard with Elspeth Conquers Death. There's just all kinds of really heavily played cards in this format that play in graveyards. I want to be able to deny our opponent the chance to do that, and sometimes being able to deny them an Euro, very important. So Scavenging Ooze, even though it's not a Deathtouch creature, still goes in the deck. Same thing with Lurrus, not a Deathtouch creature, but incredibly annoying for your opponents alongside Deathtouch creatures. This is the only truly resilient element in the deck. I didn't think there were enough 1- and 2-drop creatures to really warrant it going in the main, but if we are playing against decks that destroy our creatures over and over, there are a lot of them in the format, then Lurrus can come in from the sideboard and help us out with that a little bit. Being able to get back Chevilles and Mire Tritons and even Foulmire Knights and stuff can sometimes be really important in terms of, creating longevity for our deck. Aside from that, we've also got 4 copies of Occam Adversary. This comes in for fairly obvious reasons, and it's nice to have a Deathtouch creature in the board. We can't have just like a bunch of non-Deathtouchy stuff in the board because it kind of screws up our whole plan when we go to sideboard. So we need some Deathtouch creatures in the board, and there's none better for sideboarding than Adversary. Now here are your power rankings right here, a final score of 62, and it is middling in a few categories, and that's because I hate to report, after all this talk, that the Deathtouch deck is still a casual deck at heart. Now, I've been testing this deck in Platinum ranked on Arena, and that has not been as unpleasant an experience as I would have thought, but it also has been humbling at times. The deck is not quite resilient enough, especially in Game 1, to deal with decks playing a whole lot of sweepers, or just generally decks that control the game and board state, until they can do their big thing, right? The Bant deck that plays literally all of the best cards in the format, very good against us. Elspeth Conquers Death takes out all of our best cards, and Teferi is very good against cards like Hooded Blightfang, for instance. But on the flip side of that, I will say that the absolute best matchups for the deck are some of the most annoying matchups in the format, i.e. mono-red aggro, but also the mono-white aggro decks that are popping up here and there. If your opponent is playing a fair number of creatures in their deck, the Deathtouch deck might be just the right deck for you, because this deck affords the aggro opponent an awful lot of opportunities to make mistakes. And a smart, experienced Deathtouch deck player knows how to create those opportunities for their opponent to make mistakes. So a good pilot can take this deck a good long way, and it's a lot of fun to play. Because again, there's usually moments in games, especially against other creature-based decks, where you have to switch from offense to defense and then back again. And knowing when to do that is paramount to actually winning games. So it's a fun, interesting deck with a lot of wrinkles and a lot of dimensions, especially for just a Deathtouch aggro deck. So I want you to try it out, and if you want to try it out, hit that link in the description, go over to TCG Player, pick the deck up for relatively cheap. It's a little over $100, but it's still way cheaper than most of the best decks in this format right now. And if you're having specific trouble with mono red, this is a good deck to pick up and try out. So give it a shot if you possibly can. If you order through the link in the description, you'll be helping your dude out. Aside from that, other ways you can help me out is hitting like. That helps, I think, with the algorithm. I'm not actually sure. I think commenting's supposed to help with the algorithm, but I'm not actually 100% sure about that either. But either way, do the thing. Do that stuff. Subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. And if you really want to help determine what content we even do around here, then, yeah, join the Patreon. Link in the description for that. It's just $1 a month to vote on what decks we even do. And sometimes the polls are extremely close. Like, one vote will make the difference. So get in there. $1 a month is all I ask. I think I'm worth it. But that's pretty much all I got for this one. Don't forget to let me know how you feel about it down there in the comments section. Do you think it should play more 1-drops, or do you think we should play more bite effects in the main deck? There's a lot of different directions you could go with this deck right now. There's actually way more support than Deathtouch than there's ever been since I was a YouTuber, at least. So just let me know what your build looks like down there in the comments section. Do all the YouTube stuff, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dub from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.